I am joined today by two excellent speakers. Our featured author is Kristen Arnett, the author of With Teeth, a novel, and the New York Times bestselling debut novel, Mostly Dead Things, which was a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award in fiction. She is a queer fiction and essay writer. Her work has appeared at the New York Times, The Cut, Oprah Magazine, Guernica, Buzzfeed, McSweeneys, PBS Newshour, The Guardian, Salon, and elsewhere. Her next book, an untitled collection of short stories, will be published by Riverhead Books. She has a master's in library and information science from Florida State University and currently lives in Miami, Florida. Kristen is joined in conversation by Kay Huggins, host of the Raindrop Corner podcast. Kay is a queer woman of color with a passion for birthing thought-provoking content, championing nonprofit efforts, and human rights advocacy. She is a longtime resident of Jacksonville, Florida. For the better part of 10 years, her life has been dazzled with project management, writing, poetry, content creation, production, and unique forms of artistry. She has utilized these varied areas of focus to highlight the importance of POC visibility and culture. And we are so delighted to have both of them here. Kay, take it away.
I have to give it up to you for just that awesome intro. It's awesome to be here. And Kristen, it's awesome to be here with you. I've been really looking forward to this conversation. And I wanted to start out with just talking about the beauty of storytelling and how that impacts our life. You've written of really good work that really kind of talks about the human condition in a fun, but also dark and really just touching and gripping way. So tell me a little bit about the stories that have influenced your writing as you kind of grew up and went from being a reader to a writer.
I love that question because I do think as writers, we are first and foremost readers. So the things that we take in as we move through our careers is like a constant influx of just like art in all its kinds of forms. And I'm a person who, like, I'm a huge reader, but also like I like to think a lot about different kinds of art, and I use art very loosely because I don't like to be like, I'm not trying to be like really bougie or classist. Like I love TV, like I love it. I love reality television. I love like comedy specials. I love like, I don't know. I love any kind of thing where I can ingest it and then like kind of interrogate it. Like I love zombie movies. I think there's ways in which like a lot of different, there's like ways in which it's good for October. It's like, ooh, spooky. But there's ways in which like a lot of different kinds of work. But if I had to like talk specifically about books, there's a lot of ways in which like very specific books and very specific authors inform me. Because I mean, growing up, I grew up in a very Southern Baptist evangelical household, and the books that I was allowed to read were like, had to be like, my parents had to like allow me to read them. And quite often I was like not allowed to read a lot of work. And I was very hungry for, I don't know, just I think escapism, or like, I think we're all kind of do that a lot of the time, where it's like this feeling of being trapped and like wanting to like create worlds so you can just kind of move inside of them and feel really free. And I would read literally anything. Like if I found something, I would read it because I was so excited. And I really got into like reading a lot of like Stephen King. I was thrilled to read like a lot of Stephen King. I was never allowed to read it, so I would have to hide it like under my dresser. Like I would have to hide it and then like kind of like sit on the floor and like pull the book out and like try and read it. And a big thing of that for me, and I'm still like, I love to go back to those like retro Stephen King books and look at them as a writer in terms of like creative process, because there's things that happen in those books that I think still influence the ways that I like to think about world building, for one, dialogue, and like the way that pop culture kind of influences, also just like the idea of like suspense, or what makes something sad or tender or scary, or how you can prolong some kind of thing. So there's like, I spent a lot of time like interrogating those books at first because I was like, it felt very titillating for me, like forbidden material. And then very much because I was like, this is doing something I really like on a craft level. What is it that I like? And interrogating it in that different kind of way. Another book very much, like I think the book that I read that made me know that I wanted, like that writing wasn't just like something that was just like me sitting alone, you know, kind of doodling or kind of like putting a story together for myself, was the Dorothy Allison's Bastard Out of Carolina.
That book has my heart.
I know. That book, I mean, first of all, Dorothy, Jesus, but that book is like such a place book too. And I feel like so attached at the hip, maybe attached at the body to Florida. So like reading that book and that, like, its like connection to South Carolina was like, I was like, I'm reading a book. And it's also a book that's like deeply queer, but without like having, it doesn't use the language of that queerness inside of it. It's like still so deeply embedded, like you can't like scrape it out. You can't like take like the South Carolina out of the place. You can't take the queerness out of it in that work. And it's such a, I read that book and I felt really seen. And I think that like as writers and as readers, like we want to like find work that like resonates and it feels like somebody's talking, like somebody's like tapping on your shoulder and talk like they're talking right to you. And that's what that book felt like to me. And I was like, if this is a book that's like allowed to be a book and it's a beautiful book, then it's like, that's what I want to do. Like I want to write like place writing like this that feels like so intense. But I do think too, there's like I could talk, I love this question. I do feel like it's like, but yeah, there's like lots of ways in which like different kind of art, I think, like, or storytelling, like what is a story, right? Like how stories sit inside of families, like how stories like, right? Like the stories that are told inside of a household and kind of passed on and retold and retold. I think that's a way of like craft and like art and like how like, or the millionth time like somebody's told like a story in your family and how what things stay the same and what things differ. Those things feel like storytelling to me and I'm interested in them. But there's a million, I'm gonna stop. I feel like I will ramble on forever about this, but I love that question.
But I mean, yeah, you pose really good points too, because it is a form of craft. Like from the moment you tell your mom or your dad or your sister or your brother a story, and then how they tell that story to another person and how they're remembering and framing it. And I love when you said specifically that you interrogate the books. It's such a fun way to frame it, but we do that as we read. And you mentioned world building. So in your stories, a lot of times when the word world building comes up, it's used more so in terms of writing a fantasy or a science fiction book. And a lot of times people fail to realize that world building is something that goes into every form of novel. So for you, specifically for your novels, where you deal a lot with family-based relationships, how does that world building look for you as you're crafting those novels?
I think that they're just going to be different with each project I work on. And that's like necessary, I think, like, especially with, because every new work is its own like weird baby that like requires a lot like different attention. And like, here's my child, like they need this kind of thing from me. But I do think specifically with Mostly Dead Things, I spent a lot of time thinking about it as a sensory experience. Like I was like, because I felt really like put on my heart to like, because Florida feels very special to me. Specifically like Central Florida. And I go out of my way not to say Orlando and Mostly Dead Things. And part of that was like, I don't want readers to come in with like baggage. Like, I don't want them to come in being like, this is a book about Orlando. I'm already coming in thinking about Mickey Mouse and theme parks and like those kind of things. Because Orlando is like a huge place that's like,
so much more than just the amusement parks there.
Exactly. So I was like, I really want it to be a situation. When people ask, I was like, how much of the book is you? I was like, the most part of the book that is me, that book is how Florida is. I was like, I think I'm Florida in the book, because I was like, what does it feel like? What do you hear outside? What does it smell like in different places? Like, what are you encountering as you're going around? Like, what does the air feel like? It felt really important in terms of world building for me, for like that, because that's a first person book too with Jessa, to be like, and it's like, okay, like I think I saw something that popped up about like what the synopsis, my elevator pitch for Mostly Dead Things is like, lesbian daughter takes over the family's taxidermy business after her father commits suicide. That classic story, you know, the classic tale of taxidermy and lesbianism in Central Florida. But it is a book where I was like, okay, like this is a book about like mess. I mean, and I think that I thought a lot about. Like, I was like, I'm gonna move I'm gonna see through Jess's eyes and move through. And I was like, I want her to experience like the vibrancy of like what it's like to live in Florida, because Florida is such a hard, fascinating, kind of violent place. Like, it's a place where like the weather turns on like in a second. It's like a place where it's like there's like any kind of number of animals and things that can kill you. It's a place where it's like really already categorized as like, oh, we know what you are, and you're like weird and gross. And I was like a very Florida man kind of thing. And I was like fascinated with unpacking that. And I was like, a good way for me to do that is to like take my characters like through the landscape. So even when you're inside, you feel like you're outside in that book. And when I was writing with Teeth, it was like a completely different process in terms of world building, because I was like, I want this book to feel super claustrophobic. I was like, because this is a different family. It's like it's two moms who are raising a son, and it's told from a third person perspective that's a very close third person. And it's like Sammy, and she's like a stay-at-home mom with her son, and like how that household begins to unravel, and how much of it is like, I've thought a lot about like the fact that like everybody in a household's an unreliable narrator. Like the idea that like everybody's sharing a shared narrative, but no one's telling it the same way. And some people are telling it like really differently than other people. And I was like, I wanted a really unreliable narrator in this like character. But like so much of that I think is like me thinking about like human beings are like so messy. Like everybody's just like inherently, I don't know. I was like, that's a book about like, I think With Teeth is like a book about like, failure in some ways. I was like, this is like a mom who like wants to be a good mom, and she's like failing. Like she's not a great mom, and she's not a great person, and she's like not a good partner all the time. And I was like, she fails. And I was like, I'm more interested in the failure. So I think that like for me, the world building there was like so much about like, I have to build a world as through the lens of an unreliable narrator. And that was a very different process. And I think any like the books I'm working on now or things that are happening is like, it's still like a world that's situated inside like the wildness, the kind of feralness of Florida, but it's like how the families and protagonists move through it, like demand different kinds of world building. I think you're so right too, what you said, like, it's not like world building can happen. Like you could have a novel that takes place inside of a single room, and you have, I think the world building would be so much harder for that kind of thing.
Exactly, because you have a confined space.
Yeah, I mean, it is like, but I think it's like, right, like each kind of piece of work like requires its own I don't know, kind of consideration for like because the world that you're building is like what, like what is it? It doesn't mean like logistically, like physically where things are. Sometimes it means like how the feeling and the energy of the people that inhabit it, because it's that space. So I do think it's like, for me, like it feels like a thing where it's like, it's constantly like a work in progress. And like for this time, this world feels like this, or like here's the kind of, I've been describing it as like shape, like what's the shape of the novel. And I think that a good way to think about that too is like, is to think about the shape of the world. Like the shape of the narrative is like kind of attached. This is a great question. I'm gonna think about this all night, honestly.
I brought it up because I was talking about this with another writer, and we got onto like a tangent for like a whole hour. We don't have that much time today, but at the same like point of it all, I think it's really important for us to just like think about world building from a more versatile sense, because it just in your case, you're very sensory and you use a lot of imagery in your novels. So you can really feel that. And the unreliable narrator, much to just kind of loop back into that, I feel like it kind of gives us a glimpse for how we actually are. I don't know if you played this game in high school, but there's like a game where somebody like whispers a secret to you. And the goal is to see what that secret actually was, and then what it is once it gets down the line. And normally it ends up being very different. And I think in many ways it just kind of talks about how humans are and how we all perceive things very differently. Sometimes we even will lie about those things, but you give us a really cool glimpse of that. So with the world building in mind, I want to talk more about the emotion that you add to your novels, because there's always a lot of emotion there, and you do it in a way that's just very fluid and engaging. But whether it's with a family going through grief, like in Mostly Dead Things, and there's like other issues there that were there before it happened, but they're just kind of bubbling up to the surface, versus with Teeth, where it's this very gradual thing, and there's almost like a self delusion that's going on until like it can't be denied any longer that this marriage isn't okay. I'm not okay. You're not okay. How do you incorporate emotion in tandem with your world building when you're writing?
Yeah, those were like two, yeah, like again, two very different kind of processes. For Mostly Dead Things, I thought a lot about the idea of families and grief and how everybody in a household, when dealing with something kind of tragic, like this specific story is about like the head of the household, this like dad, this father has committed suicide, and this is like the fallout from that, and it's like everybody in the household, so like Jessa, her brother Milo, his wife Bryn, their mother, like they're all, and then the kids, like her like niece and nephew, are all kind of dealing with grief, and they're all dealing with grief in like different ways, because like how people process something like that is not the same. It's like everybody deals with things in a different way. So for me writing that book, I was like, you know, because I was in first person too, I was like, we're going to be closest to Jessa, and we're going to have to deal with like her emotions, and she's like a person who doesn't want to deal with any kind of emotions. So I was like, this is a person who for a very long time, like you're absolutely right, there had been things happening inside of this family well before the thing happened with her father. So it was like, I was like, what, for myself, in terms of like interrogating the emotion happening with this specific family, I was like, what does it look like when a person has had coping mechanisms that have worked? They're like bad coping mechanisms, but they've worked. Like what happens if, like when something occurs, like for instance, the death of a parent, and those coping mechanisms suddenly don't work anymore, and you are forced to confront the kind of nature of the things that you had been able to, you know, through sex or alcohol or avoidance or work, like throwing yourself into work, or, you know, denial, or do these different things. Like, what is the thing? Like, if there's a thing that happens and finally none of that stuff works for you anymore, and you're forced to have to deal with it, what would that look like? So a lot of that emotional narrative with Jessa happened. It was like the stuff that had worked for her no longer is accessible anymore, and she's forced to have to deal with it while simultaneously having to deal with like the way her mother processes grief, which is in a way that she finds abhorrent. Like she does not, and like she takes taxidermy very seriously, and her mother is like kind of taking these taxidermy pieces and making like sexy pornographic scenes out of them, and it's like infuriating to her, and she can't understand it. And like trying to make like her mother's trying to make like some kind of meaning and art out of like this thing that's happened to her life, and then her, you know, like the way that her brother deals with it, but she's unable to. So like for me, I was like, okay, this is going to be a catastrophic event at the beginning of this book, and the coping mechanisms don't work anymore, and now we're going to see how these characters have to change because the things that had worked don't work anymore. For With Teeth, it's a slow building, and I was like, I was thinking in terms of like, well, this was like kind of dual, I think, because it is like an unreliable narrator. So we can't trust everything that like Sammy says to us all the time, which is infuriating as a writer. It's just like, okay, this is what's going on. But the second part of that was, I was like, what is dysfunction quite often? How does it work inside of a household? And to me, I thought about it a lot as like something that is a callus, right? Where it's like, where things happen inside a household where we needed to talk about that. This thing happened, we didn't talk about it. It got smoothed over because nobody wanted to deal with something. And then we're like, okay. And then when it happens again, it's doesn't feel as bad because we've like already kind of like created a pattern of behavior that's occurring. So like dysfunction like ends up like kind of layering and until it gets to a point where the dysfunction is overwhelming inside of a household, but like people aren't able to see it or not see it as clearly because people, like, I think this happens in all different kinds of families in different kinds of ways, like in any kind of relationships. Because this was a book too where I was interrogating, like, this is a married couple, two women, and they want to have this. Her wife Monica wants to have this kind of ideal. She's a lawyer. They've got like the white picket fence and a great house in a nice neighborhood, and like the three of them and a kid, and like Monica's like, I know we're gay and we're in Florida, but we're just like you. We're just like everybody else. I'm just like every other partner at the law firm. Like we are the same. We're not any different. And for Sammy, she's like, well, this is like this kind of Instagram facade of like, right, like where you're seeing a picture and you're seeing like a reel and you're thinking like, wow, what a beautiful life and family. And the reality of like those things is like the callous, is the dysfunction happening inside of a household, like what things are allowed to like slip past or let live because people are either don't want to or kind of incapable of maybe having like open communication about stuff. And I very specifically made it so they all are in therapy all the time. I was like, because I do think it's a thing too, where it's like, I think therapy is amazing. I think it's really, really good. This is me saying, yes, therapy, amazing. But I was like, I also think that there's plenty of ways in which people like use they're like, well, I'm in like, we're in therapy, but it's like, however, it's like, it also is a thing where it's like, how much are you putting into this? Like how much of the authentic thing are you dealing with here? And sometimes that's nothing, like, it's like, if you just show up and just talk about something and not deal with something. So again, like the kind of like a level of dysfunction. And I think I was thinking a lot about the ways in which small things become, right? Like the thing that sometimes tips, like, is like the thing that's, like too far, is not a huge thing quite often. When it's like built up to that point, it's almost like, this is it. This this small thing happened and it's like just a cataclysmic kind of thing going on. So I was thinking about like the kind of sand that has to build up to build the giant like mound of terror. This is a gorgeous way to describe a book. It's like, I'm like, it's a terror, mound of terror.
But I have to say, I think that was one of my favorite things about your book, because a lot of times in fiction, when dysfunction or pain or angst is being described, or even depression or anxiety, sometimes those things work together. Sometimes they work separately in a novel, but there is an aversion to therapy, or maybe it's shown in a positive light and it's like the person's doing all the right things and they're in therapy. And I really enjoyed the fact that you used therapy as a way to show this can be effective, but are the characters in this novel utilizing the tools? Are they utilizing external tools so that they can heal? And I just really think that that's a beautiful thing. And one of the core themes that I get from both books, like having read them, is just that chord of healing through truth, uncomfortable truth, and just like the truth that's been there all along. So as you are writing these themes about healing, how has your own personal healing bled into your writing?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think that's a great question for every kind of art, right? Like, I think inherently the things that just as we're growing and learning and failing and struggling and trying as people, like that kind of necessarily bleeds into the things that we make. I definitely feel like, I don't know, because I do think it's like, to use the word again, I think interrogating like the kind of idea of like what, like, so for instance, like the things I am like the most obsessive about or the most interested in are the things I'm constantly trying to like unpack, like, because I want to know why. I'm like, why do I like this? Why am I interested in it? Why am I so drawn to this kind of idea or thought, or like, I think that's like the germ, maybe like I hesitate deeply to say the grain of sand inside the oyster, because I do not want to compare any work I've made to a pearl. So whatever little germ that creates the monster that has emerged. But it is that kind of thing where it starts off with this kind of niggling, bothering, why can't I stop thinking about this? Because I do think like a novel has to be a kind of like obsessive passion. Otherwise you can't stay with it, like a story like that. And so like for Mostly Dead Things, it started off for me as like literally a joke. Like I was like, I was obsessed with bad taxidermy. I was like very like, it was kind of a blow off thing for me. Like I was working really a lot. I was going to school at night. I was like tired. I was like, I love looking at this stupid taxidermy, this awful, awful taxidermy. And it brought me a lot of pleasure. And as I always do, I was like, oh, I love it so much. I'm like, why do I love it? I was like, why am I like interested in this? And it became a thing where I was like, okay, well now I have to unpack it. I got to think about it now. And so I started doing like a lot of research about taxidermy. And then it turned into something where I was like, I love the idea, and maybe this is like the librarian part of my brain. I am obsessed with the idea of kind of like finding out this, like the stuff I don't know, the kind of digging and excavation work of like that. I think it like really holds hands with writing, the kind of idea of like, right, digging into like the truth or trying to find out like what sits at the heart of something. And it's kind of like how I think about writing, like how I think about working the reference desk. I'm really bringing a lot of library to this right now. Where it's like, where people come up and they'll ask you about something, but quite often it's like you're not trying to answer the question they've asked you, you're trying to figure out what they're actually trying to ask you. It's like kind of question that like sits underneath the question. And that's what fiction is for me also. I'm like, here's the question, but then as I'm working, as I'm digging through whatever thing, I'm like, oh, this is what I'm actually trying to ask, this thing buried down underneath. And that's like, I think that's a me thing. I was like the kind of like, I'm very open and honest with the fact that I don't know anything. I never know what's going on. I feel like I don't understand anything most of the time. I think I'm really very excited to learn. I feel like I'm always like on a quest of like looking for information and discovery, but I'm like the first person who will be like, oh, I don't know. But I'm willing to like look something up. Because I think that's like I don't know, anytime I feel like I think I know something, that's when I figure out that I don't really know anything about it at all, or I only know a portion of something. And that's like maybe the exciting thing about writing. Writing to me is like kind of investigating to try and get as close as I can to the real question that I'm trying to ferret out. So for Mostly Dead Things, it became like, I'm trying to, and it took me a long time to figure out like what I was actually trying to think about there was I was like, nostalgia is taxidermy, memory is taxidermy, like how people choose to hold on to things and shape it and hold it in their mind as a form of taxidermy. Grief is a kind of taxidermy. And I was like, oh God, this is like what I'm trying to do. And this is what I'm interested in. And with Teeth was like really me trying to write that book and then being like, the ways in which like, I'm interested in the ways that I'm interested in the ways that, first of all, people are messy, but also that like queer people can fail at things. Or like, I was like, I'm interested to read and know about like what it is, like the process of failure, like to try your best and still, be a failure. And I was like, I don't want to like, I was like, because they're a queer person, it has to be like, they have to be amazing at everything. And I was like, plenty of people are, I'm including myself in this, are like not great at lots of things. And I was like, so I think it was like an interrogation of a lot of that stuff, was like really trying to like, and I think that's like trying to figure out like the emotional truth for myself of those things, is like trying to figure out what I'm trying to ask. I don't know if that's a good answer, but that's probably like.
It is a good answer though, because and I don't want to speak for every writer, but I just know for me as well, when I'm writing, there is a spark. There is something that I'm curious about. It's a question, it's an idea, it's a concept, and that causes me to dig deeper. And I loved what you said, because I feel like we learn the most when we admit that we don't know, and then we're open to the experience, and then also we're more equipped to share that experience with other people. I know that we kind of touched on this when we were talking about world building and also adding emotion into the story, but craft a scene for me with that concept. You stated that, you're asking a question, you're diving in, craft a scene and take us through what that experience is like as you're starting to write.
Oh, I think it's simultaneously like very fun and very terrifying, because I love to go into any kind of writing situation feeling like I know even less than the character. Like I don't want to know anything. Like I don't outline. I'm not a person that outlines. I love going into any kind of project because I am also a person too that can sometimes feel like easily bored. And if I feel like I know it's going to happen in a scene, I get bored, and I worry as the person making work that if I am bored, then a reader is absolutely bored to tears. So because we are like, right, like we're the most like, even though we're our harshest critics, I think writers, we're also the ones who care the most about any kind of thing we're making. It's ours, so we are going to care the most. So like in terms of like writing a scene, quite often my ideal situation is to kind of feel like, oh man, I'm really being gross. I'm really like selling myself as like, I'm like, oh, here's like a beautiful like tool of writing. I'm like, I like something to feel like I'm basically kind of throwing up on the page. I don't want it to be clean. I don't really need things to like make a ton of sense at first. I need it to feel a little raw, and I need it to feel like honest in whatever terms of like, this is what this character is trying to get at and what they feel like. And like if that's them like swearing a bunch, if that's them like, you know, making a bad decision, if that's them kind of being at a bar drinking too much, if that's them like, you know, like I think a good scene to talk about, like I would try not to be spoilery if people haven't read Mostly Dead Things, but like that scene, the peacock scene, where she goes out with her niece and nephew into the field to get the peacocks, and they are like gonna get these peacocks and take them, and the peacocks start out alive and the scene did. I don't know. it's a way where it's like, okay, like, you know, when I went into writing that scene, I was like, well, I have no idea what's about to happen right now. I felt like as shocked as like Jessa going into that scene. I was like, okay, I guess this is what's occurring. I like a feeling of like total surprise, and I delight in that. I really delight in it. That's when I feel like I've done some really good writing. And you know, maybe it isn't great writing, but I love feeling in that moment the kind of momentum. And so I think if I feel the momentum of like moving forward and like just like tackling like whatever is happening in there and just furiously just trying to get as much as I can into the document and being like, I'm going to see this through. And if, you know, it doesn't stay, if it changes, if it needs to get cleaned up, probably a lot. I mean, I won't even stop to fix a typo. I'm just like, let's keep going. Let's go. Like if I feel like I have momentum, then it's like, I feel like I'm actually working. Because I feel
the beauty is rewrites. Like that's part of being a writer. So
yes,
the cool thing is like, you'll have plenty of time to clean it up later.
There's plenty of time to be like really terrible to ourselves and write like a horrible note in the margin of whatever we're doing, saying like, oh God, or fix this. But when there's those moments of like really propulsive, like action or like meaningful, like sitting down and like, even like in a short story or an essay, like something like that, where I start to feel like, it's like you can almost feel like I'm gonna use a Florida, like a little analogy here, like the kind of wave, like if you're like the tide where you can really start feeling it pull back to pull up into a huge knockdown wave, that kind of feeling you can feel like as you're trying to work on something, you're like, oh, okay, it's coming. Like I can feel it and I want to stay here with it. I'm going to stay with it. Because I don't think that happens necessarily all the time. A lot of times we're in the dregs of like second guessing ourselves, or like, here's a messy scene, or my sentences aren't all beautiful. Like, and I think that that's like the way I like to think about work, especially draft wise, is just kind of like letting the tide pull me out. Like maybe we're gonna drown out there, but like, okay, like at least I want to like get pulled along. Just really making I'm saying a lot of things like drowning, throwing up, like just all kinds of stuff.
But they're all the right things. They're the things that work for you. And I think a lot of time there's a lot of stigma on writing. So I don't know if everybody uses this term, but the term that people use a lot for just kind of writing as it comes to you is pantsing, or writing at the seat of your pants. So I think a lot of times there's a quadrant of people in the writing community that are like, oh, you have to outline, you have to do X, Y, Z. And the truth is like different things work for different people. And I think it's cool because like it shows in your writing. I can almost tell that you are surprised with the characters because of the amount of dimension and emotion that you put into it. And you created, without meaning to, a really good segue for our next question. So I wanted to ask you, what are some of the biggest untruths that you've learned through the course of writing?
Oh, wow. I think I learn and unlearn things every time I am working on anything, because I think I have like this kind of like dual things going in my brain, because like as a writer, I really like the kind of freedom to explore without an outline and like just for my own personal process. I think you're so right. I think the reason writing is even good or books are even good is because everybody's all different. And so everybody's process is different. And that's what makes people exciting, and that's what makes work exciting. But it's like this, I don't know, my librarian brain wants me to have like best practices or like process and procedures and be like, okay, if I do XYZ, then the like desired outcome is these things, because I have put the practice in place, and here are my rules, and here's my document, and here's like what I'm going to do. And that never works the way I want it. And every time I figure out the rules for each like project, the next book I'll go into it and try and work that way, and I ultimately find that it won't work for that next book, and I'm so frustrated every time. I think, and so maybe the thing I've had to learn is that like, and I'm going to continue to have to relearn it, is that every single time I sit down to make a project, I am going to try and use those rules that worked on the last project, and they are going to fail me, and I'm going to get upset, and then I have to make new rules, and it's just going to happen every single time. Oh, I
Does
hate it.
accepting that make it easier though for you?
No,
Like,
it's terrible. It's terrible. It's not, I hate it. But it's just a fact. It's like a fact that I keep having to relearn over and over again. But I don't know, if I'm not learning, then I guess if we're not learning, then we're dead. So it's good. It's good for me to be like learning.
that's very true. And I would say, so the last question that I have for you, because I know that we're coming into our Q&A time, what has writing done for you? How has writing healed you personally?
I think the most honest I'm able to be, like pretty much in my life, or like, I think it's helped me to, I like we were talking about this, to like learn and unlearn. I think those things are like so important. And I think when I'm like sitting with work, like work won't really allow you to fake it. Like it doesn't do what you want it to do if you're sitting there like half-assing it or not telling whatever the truth is, because I think truth is subjective quite often.
Mhm.
Like, you know, that like if you're not doing the work, whatever the work is there, then it's like, then the work shows it, and then it's frustrating and like won't, and it's like basically like it forces me to sit down and actually confront like what I might think about something. And that's hard. I think that's just hard as people to like be like, okay, now I have to like, quite often I say this all the time, it's like, oh, like when I figure out that something actually is an essay or something's I'm like, oh God, oh no, now I have to sit down and actually deal with this. And it's like a thing where it's like, I like say that, but then it's like, I'm gonna like unpack something or kind of uncover something that's a truth. Or if it's not a truth, then it's like a segue into a greater conversation. Like, right? Like it's like a segue into like a conversation with like, I want my work to not necessarily just like sit with me. Like I'm so interested in the idea of like community and like how things touch each other, and like, you know, how maybe my work would spawn like other conversations and other work that then you like echo back, and I get to like be in conversation with that. Like that's exciting to me. That's like the most exciting thing I can think of about art, is like how it ripples and how it like sounds back. And it's not like you're not in, even though writing can be in a silo, like art isn't in a silo. It's like experience like inside of a community, and it's like such a, you know, the way that it can be an embrace in a conversation, I think is like the thing that I need from it. And I think that I get so much from that. And even when it's like the hardest struggle some days to work, it's worth it for that alone, because it does make me feel like maybe I'm calling out into like a canyon and it's far away, but I hear the voice come back, and that I wouldn't trade that for anything. I feel like I need it for my heart and for my spirit, maybe.
That is a beautiful thing. I talked with a poet recently, and she said something that stuck with me. And she said that art is always collaborative. And I feel like everything that you said really vivifies that, the ability to create a dialogue and talk about a really true and vulnerable essence of the human condition, and then use that as a way for people to add to that conversation and create work that just really spotlights that. And I think it helps us understand ourselves in tandem as we're writing, and we're sharing that writing with other people. So it is truly a joy to get a glimpse into your magic and just hear about what your process has been like. And also your ideologies. I think that is so important, just the community aspect of writing. And I feel like my best years of writing was writing that I was doing in tandem within the community and welcoming that and just kind of ingraining myself in that. So thank you so much for sharing all of that with all of us today.
Thank you. You're so wonderful. You asked the greatest questions. These are all really good.
Well, thank you. I wanted to really like get you talking about like the cogs behind the writing, because as we're reading it, like we meet these characters and we see these settings and we're in these environments. But I think outside of that, like I do personally like to know, and maybe this is just the lover of art, and I work with a lot of artists in our local community and in North Florida in general, and my favorite thing is learning what makes them tick. Why did you create this? What do you think about? So it was really cool getting a glimpse into that.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to butt in here and ask our audience questions. So I'm going to combine a couple of the questions together. So the first one we have is, do you write? And how many writing projects do you have going on at one time?
Do I write every day? I try to. I think that's, and here's where I will pop in ahead of myself and say, me saying what I do is not what I think. I think practices are like, it's like, do you do an outline? Do you not do an outline? It's totally up to the author. It's totally up to you and how you do a project. For myself, it does feel important for me to try and work every day, because for myself, it feels like training a muscle, where it's like, the more I do it, the more in practice I get, the kind of easier it is. I like to write and I like to read every day. Sometimes that's hard to do. And I say this as a person who wrote mostly dead things, like in small pockets of time when I was working all day and then like going to school at night and having to do stuff with my kid. I was like a single parent. Trying to like find little pockets of time to write is very fucking hard. Excuse me. It's like hard to do. I get very passionate, I swear. It's hard to do. So it's like, I know it's like, there's things where it's like, sometimes it just feels worth it to me because I feel worse when I don't work. I don't feel good not working. So it's like, I know, and training that muscle to work every single day is so beneficial to me mentally. I think spiritually, I think I just like having like a practice like that, where even if it's like, at the end of the day, I feel like it's trash and I want to throw it out. I'd rather like make the garbage than not work. So I do try and work every day. And right now, this is the thing. This is like, we're still in the middle of a pandemic. It's like very difficult, right? Like if you're making anything at all, amazing. Like it's so hard. Our brains are all, it's just so hard right now. And it's really difficult. So for a long while, I was really struggling. For the past like while, I would like try and work every day, and it would be stuff I threw out. I'm like, this is nothing. Like, this is not good. And what I started trying to do actually was like, because I felt like my brain wasn't doing what I wanted it to do. I didn't feel like it was I feel like it was an unreliable narrator. So I was like, I don't trust its opinion right now about like what I'm making. So I started kind of just shuttling stuff into like a document and like keeping it. And when I wanted to throw it out, I'd be like, I'm going to look at this later. I'm going to look at it later, like not later tomorrow or even like next week, like later, like 3 months from now, and let's have a reassessment. So I got to like around March of this like year, and all of a sudden it felt like somebody came and turned the top on the faucet. Like it was like there was like a kink in the hose or something, and somebody would woo, and it was like I was like, I am going to work like wildfire. And so I ended up writing like the drafts of like 3 different novels. Like I wrote like 3 different novel drafts in the span of like 4 months. Will those things ever see the light of day? I don't know. Maybe not, but maybe so. For me, it was like, I actually was able to work on a project. I was like, oh my God. I was like, I'm going to take advantage of this. So like, but normally like in the past, but I say this in the past, like every single time, like the way I work is going to be different. So, you know, like previously it's been like, here's my one project I'm working on. All my focus is going into that. Now I'm like, here's these 3 different projects. They're all really different from each other. I think they're valuable in different ways. Like they're messy in different ways. So I'm working on like, I'll sit with like anything. I sent a draft of one of them to my agent. So hear what she has to say. But I think, again, it's like, honestly, at this point, I was like, at least I was just working. I think it's like we need to like give ourselves a little bit of slack creatively, because I think it's so hard to make art anyway. And this has not been like this has been a hard time to make art. It's a hard time just in general. So yes, I am making things. I don't know if they're anything. That's a good answer.
Perfect. I love it. All right. I'm going to ask, well, there's a lot of compliments that I'm about to give you, and then there's a question. And if anybody else has questions that they want to ask, please throw them in the chat so that I can ask them after this very long question. All right. I really enjoy your writing and how well you incorporate rich description of what it's actually like to live in Florida into your books. You just nail life in Central Florida, as well as lesbian life in Florida. I love how you do not shy away from the messy. As Floridians, we know how different and distinctive each part of the state can be. Will any of your next writing include other parts of Florida, like South Florida? Also, go Knowles.
That felt very funny to have that go Knowles in there. Yes, thank you. Here's how I feel about that. I think this is such a good question, and it's a question I ask myself a lot, especially living in Miami now, because I have for like the last year lived in Miami. I've been, which is new for me. I think like we like as Floridians, we know that like people say Florida, and it's such a large, disparate state. Like we know that like, right, like Jacksonville is not Orlando, is not Miami, is not like the Panhandle, is not Tallahassee, it's not like Pensacola, it's not the Keys. Like that stuff is all so different, right? Like it's not Tampa. Like those things are like all like the people that live there are all different. The culture is different. Like being in Miami, like, yeah, it's a completely different, like the plants are different, like the air is different. And it's like a 3.5 hour drive from Orlando. And it's like, it's so fascinating to be like, this is a completely different space. I really like, yes, I want to write about it very desperately. I think about it all the time. And it's like, the way I feel about writing about Orlando, I feel so like cagey and trying to be careful and like thoughtful about it. I want to be the exact same kind of thoughtful about like what I'd write about Miami, you know, coming in and being like, I've lived here like a year. I think I do want to write about it, but I want it to be in a way that feels like respectful, because I feel like, so I want to be respectful to Florida and like the ways that I write about it. And I would want to be thoughtful and mindful. I also think I'm scared. I'm revealing this now. I think I'm afraid. I don't want to do a disservice. I mean, and that's how I feel all the time writing about Florida, where it's like, I don't want to ever presume that I know like that I'm like some kind of person that knows what Florida is. Like obviously no, I'm like, here's like my little slice of experience, you know, of living in Florida. And that's like my personal experience, and it's small and it doesn't even encompass all the myriad different experiences of different kinds of people living here. So I'm afraid to write about Miami, but I want to, is the short way to answer that maybe.
Awesome. Well, good luck if you take on that endeavor. I have one more question in the chat, which is, who are your sounding boards for your work?
I do kind of write like really alone a lot of the time. I don't have a ton of readers. I have one reader who he's my buddy Willie. We met at Penn House. I had not had a reader before him. He started reading my like short fiction and stuff. I think one of those things is like I always want to have a mutual respect for like anybody that like we're like sharing work with each other. It feels very intimate to me. I don't know. I'm a person that also thinks getting a haircut feels intimate. So I'm like nervous, right? I'm like, that sounds intimate. So like sharing work feels like, not because I'm scared that like, I'm like, I don't want a criticism, because I really like, I love like feedback, but I want it to be like sharing work like with another person. I want it to feel like, again, I'm like being respectful. I like Willie for me is a person who I want to share work with somebody that we have constant conversations about art. And I want to know that we like, I want to feel like it's a fruitful, meaningful, like anybody who's seeing my work is like, I'm going to take it back and then I'm going to like take those notes and then I'm going to be like, this is like, I'm going to build and grow from it. And I feel that I have that relationship with that fellow writer. And I also feel like it's important for me for a person to see the places where I like will bullshit or something, excuse me again, where it's like, you know, like the places where we as writers or as artists, like where it feels too hard, so we dodge something in the work or something. I need somebody to like that will know those things about me and like be able to call it out and see it and point at it and be like, you know, you did this. Let's take a little look at that. And that's helpful to me. I'm also going to be that lesbian and say my reader that reads my work the most now is my girlfriend. I've never dated another writer before, so this is like a new thing for me. And she's a very talented writer. She's like a TV critic and a food critic, and she also like writes essay work, and now she's writing a lot of fiction and is doing really well. She has like such a good eye for things, and we have such good conversations about work that I feel like it was like harder for me to like give her my work than it was for me to like ask her out. But it was like she just is, I think, like has such a good eye. It's like, right, like when you're able to like kind of talk about work in a way that feels like the light bulb is going off in your head. And those two people specifically for me feel like such a, like I feel the light bulb going off even when we're not talking about my work. Maybe I feel like I need it a little more. They'll be like, I feel like when I talk to them about work in general, like when we read things or books or like, you know, kidney donation piece, you know, you want to have those people you can have a conversation with about art and the internet in these times. So those are two people for me, but I also, that's another thing too. I think it's like some people, it's like really beneficial for like to have a wide net. My friend, another Florida writer, Takira Madden, she has such a wide range of readers, and it's so beneficial and fruitful to her. Like she has like probably 10 people read her work at least all the time, and that's the way that she does things, and I think it only helps her, and she loves it. Like it's such a helpful thing. So it's another one of those things where it's like having like, you know, who reads your work is like as much as like, you know, do you outline, do you not outline, like what's your process, like do you write every day, do you write every week, do you like, you know, write when it hits you? I think like how, you know, what kind of readers do you have, what kind of community do you have? But aside from that, I have such a supportive community of other writers where we deeply value and champion each other's work. And I think that like, you know, like when it's like published, I think for me, like Jamie Attenberg is like such a mentor for me. Like she has published so many great books, and like, you know, she doesn't have an MFA, and she's like, you know, she writes about families and stuff, and like being able to talk to her about like what the publication process is like for her, and like what stuff she's been through has been like so helpful to me as a writer. So I think having like a community of writers, it doesn't mean those people need to read your work when it's in its like rough little stages, at least not for me, but it's been like, I need those people to bounce stuff off, just being like, hey, like I don't feel like they get anxiety of things, right? Like I have anxiety, or I'm not feeling great, or I am feeling good, or like, you know, like, and also just like supporting each other. I think that's like, I do feel like I have a robust community of like those writers in my life, and I feel so thankful for it and really lucky.
Awesome. All right, I've got one last question. The last question of the night is going to be, there are a lot of doppelgangers in With Teeth. Was that part of your aesthetic vision of the novel going in, or was it a surprise as you were writing it?
I think it's one of those surprises, because it's one of those things where it's like, I think we write about like what we're like really interested in, and I'm very interested in that. And so it's like one of those things where it's like I just found it cropping up. I mean, the book's title wasn't even originally With Teeth. And the book's title was originally Samson. Like when Riverhead bought it, it was called Samson. And like I got so many questions from my editor about like, wow, there's a lot of biting and teeth in this. I'm like, I guess there is. Like it was like one of those things where it was like there was like a lot of doppelgangers, there was a ton of teeth and biting and like a feralness that I was like, it's like one of those things that kind of does surprise me as I'm working through. Like with Mostly Dead Things, it had its own stuff too, where there was like things just sitting in there. I'm like, oh, this is popping up a lot. Somebody asked me, I made it a point, actually, this is a little anecdote. I actually haven't told this in any kind of like thing before, but it was brought to my attention that Mostly Dead Things said every time someone had coffee, it was the worst coffee of their life. In Mostly Dead Things, they're like, it's a bad cup of coffee, and every time someone has coffee, and people have coffee a lot, and they're like, why are you really obsessed with a bad cup of coffee? So like with Teeth, I was like, I am going to go out of my way to make it, if somebody has a coffee, it's going to be like at least acceptable. I was like, I can't let this be my thing. That's right. Like I think we as writers have tics, like where we like everything we write, there's this one thing, and I have to stop myself from like, I even brought up this discussion. I always want to write that someone's throwing up. And I was like, what is the reasoning behind that? I don't know. My brain just wants to throw that in there. Like someone's going to barf. I think it's like me trying to process, like they're processing emotions. And I think about that in terms of like the image in my mind is them trying to get it out of themselves. So it becomes this thing. But I think the doppelganger thing is like that. I was like, I'm just obsessed with it and fascinated by it. Like the ways in which we see ourselves and don't see ourselves, like the mirroring of things, or like, I don't know, like I'm fascinated by it, like the ways that like, so yeah, there is a lot of that in there, but it definitely was not on purpose. It was one of those things where I was like, oh, I guess you're like really, couldn't let that one go. So it's just like come to the book a million times. That's my, yeah, just like come to me for really important craft information.